Good evening, everybody. How are you? Welcome to our next class, being live streamed on race in the United States. I'm really happy to be overseeing and part of this class tonight on race and the environment. Actually, a topic that I've dedicated a fair amount of my professional and personal life to, and it's really an honor tonight to engage in this conversation. So welcome to the new school. Those of you that are in the room and on the live stream, thank you for joining the session. My name is Michelle DePass, and I'm the Dean of the Milano School of International Affairs, Management and Policy, also Tishman Professor for Environment and Sustainability here at the new school. Tonight's focus is on race and the environment, and we're going to be discussing questions of race, place, identity, and culture in the environment, and particularly the movement for environmental justice. And we're extremely fortunate to have with us two pioneers and leaders in the environmental justice movement, and our amazing guest lecturers tonight, Mia White and Carl Anthony. Before we dive into the conversation with Carl and Mia, I want to take a moment to just give some background on the environmental justice movement. The homework assignment gave a lot of background for those, but those of you that are joining us just for this evening on the live stream, it's important to understand that the modern environmental justice movement originates from the civil rights movement, and that environmental justice is the alternative discourse to the discourse on the environmental movement. And environmentalism should not just protect people, and the ecosystem, but absolutely should lift up the issues and challenges and solutions to issues in communities of color and people of color. It should focus on much more than just protecting land. So you see on the screen a picture of Warren County in North Carolina. That was a spark in the environmental justice movement in 1982 when residents of Shoco, Warren County, North Carolina, responded to a plan to dump 6,000 truckloads of toxic PCB in soil in the community. This community was 75% Black, and neither had a mayor or a city council. Residents spent 6 weeks in peaceful protest laying down in the road to prevent the trucks from driving in. 500 people were arrested, and the soil was unfortunately still dumped in Shoco. Trying to figure out how to move to my next slide. That's spacebar, thank you. Okay, this is Tom Goldtooth, who is the head of the Indigenous Environmental Network, a warrior in environmental justice, somebody I've learned from over the past few decades. He is very much involved in terms of Indigenous rights and also in bringing about in 1991 the National People of Color Leadership Summit, amongst many other delegates, that discussed militarism, defense, religious freedom, and cultural survival, energy, sustainable development, transportation, housing, sovereignty rights, self-determination, and employment. Why? Because this was a conversation about the holistic opportunity to be able to make the communities a better place, to be able to take on the rights that have been lost. It was at this meeting that the 17 principles of environmental justice were actually designed and created to eradicate environmental racism and to bring into being true social justice and self-determination. And I think that you all were assigned the principles of environmental justice. These principles still very much hold true and hold up to whatever scrutiny in terms of the rights of self-determination of communities. Later in 1994, the Hermes Principles for Democratic Organizing were established to build organizers and activists from different cultures, politics, and organizations. The movement is always evolving, but you have to be grounded in the principles of environmental justice and the Jimenez principles to keep the values consistent and explicit. A very relevant focus of the movement right now is climate justice. While the sitting president denies that climate change is happening, communities are experiencing the impacts of drought, heat waves, storms. Climate justice focuses on the root causes of climate change, making the changes that are required to address the unequal burdens to our communities and realigning our economy and the work we do with natural systems. So there's a lot of work to be done, and we're going to be discussing some of that work tonight. 3 out of 5 Black and Hispanic Americans live in communities with toxic waste sites, and around half of all Asian Pacific Islanders and Native Americans also live in these areas. The environmental justice movement was and is a reaction to this kind of environmental racism. It's the recognition to this kind of exposure that toxins and pollutants can be a form of violence. It's an affirmation of the connection that we should have clean spaces where we can live, work, and play. Climate change has caused an increase in hurricane frequency, intensity, and because of systemic racism in communities of color, we are being disproportionately impacted. The environmental justice movement recognizes the importance of protecting human and civil rights during and after disasters and allocating resources so that people's needs can be met at their most vulnerable. With that framing, we are going to have a conversation tonight about the environmental justice movement, where it has come from, where it is now, and where it's going into the future. I want to introduce our guests this evening so you can understand some of what they bring to the table. I'll start with Mia White's bio. Mia White is an assistant professor of environmental studies in the environmental studies program here at the New School with a co-teaching appointment at Milano. She's a faculty affiliate of the Tishman Environment Design Center as well as the Heilbronner Center for Capitalism Studies, has a bachelor's degree in anthropology and political science from the State University of Stony Brook, a master's in international affairs from Columbia's School of International and Public Affairs, and a PhD in urban studies and planning from MIT. Given the diversity of her training, Mia's work is interdisciplinary, and she situates herself among radical geographers and applied anthropologists, planning urban theorists, radical sociologists, historians, and those others seeking to link social science concepts of space and race to the humanities via art and protest. Welcome, Mia. Carl Anthony. Carl Anthony is an architect, author, and urban suburban regional design strategist, is co-founder of the Breakthrough Communities Project. He has served as acting director of the Community and Resource Development Unit at Ford Foundation, responsible for the foundation's worldwide programs in the fields of environment and development and community development. He directed the foundation's Sustainable Metropolitan Communities Initiative and the Regional Equity Demonstration in the United States. Carl funded the National Conversation on Regional Equity, a dialogue of national policy analysts and advocates for new metropolitan racial justice strategies. He was the founder and, for 12 years, executive director of the Urban Habitat Program in the San Francisco Bay Area. With his colleague, Luke Cole, at the California Rural Legal Assistance Foundation, he founded and published the groundbreaking Race, Poverty, and the Environment Journal, the only environmental justice periodical in the United States. Carl also just came out with a new book entitled The Earth, the City, and the Hidden Narrative of Race. We will be celebrating his book launch here at the New School on Wednesday, November 15th from 6 to 8 p.m. I invite you all to join us then. I also have to say that Carl Anthony is one of my extreme, amazing mentors, a gentleman that has mentored actually many people of color, younger people of color, I would say, and over the past few decades, for us to be able to be warriors in our own right. And Mia, he's being flanked by another in Mia. But I definitely owe who I am today to his wisdom and counsel. So I want to thank you both for being here, and I would like us all to give a warm welcome, and I will get seated to start our panel. We are going to be circulating, actually, this is a movement, and I'm an organizer, right? So my first job was actually an organizer out of law school. And so we're going to be circulating some information and also opportunity for anybody that wants to find out more about this work. And that if you want to get to be a part of it, you want to be an organizer with us, you just give a sign up. And also we have some principles of the environmental justice here and the Jimenez principles that we're going to make sure we hand out. Okay, what we are doing first is when you have greatness in the room, you allow and provide space for greatness to be shared. So we've asked Carl to take the first 15 minutes to actually talk a bit about his own trajectory in terms of connecting to environmental justice and race. And there's a lot for him to share. And after he's done with that, then we'll go into a panel discussion. So Carl, can you introduce yourself over the next 15 minutes or so to those that are in the room and on the live stream about you, your connection to environmental justice, and really some of the dynamic spaces and places that you founded?
Thank you very much, Michelle. Can you hear me? Okay, can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, and thank you also, Mia, for your work. And I really appreciate it. I have lots of people that I've worked with over the last 40 years, 50 years, 50 years, I would say. And I had the wonderful privilege of working with many people who have been active in urban planning and environmental justice. I want to mention my partner, Dr. Paloma Pavel, who was associate with me in creating the Breakthrough Communities Project in the San Francisco Bay Area, and we are about to go on a national tour, recognizing my book and some other things that we've been doing around community mobilization. We will be visiting 12 to 15 cities over the next 15 months. You know, it's really hard to know where to begin when you when I think about all the things that have helped to shape my development in my career. I would like to begin just by telling you the story of where I was born. I was born in 1939, a year before the Second World War, and my mother and father moved to rental property in the bottom of Philadelphia. How many of you have ever heard of the bottom? Have you heard of the bottom? Well, it turns out that there are many cities in the United States that have a bottom. And basically what it means is that the lowest section of the city, very often a swamp, was built in because the speculators wanted to take advantage of the fact that African Americans and other poor people needed a place to live, and they couldn't afford to, they couldn't arrange for, because of the racism, they wouldn't arrange for them to be able to live in other sections of the city. So we lived in, what is thought of as the worst possible place you can live in the city, called the bottom. And I lived in that section. It was in West Philadelphia. And I lived for the first years of my life in that section. And I moved to a so-called better neighborhood when I was 5 years old, and my father had gotten a job in the naval shipyard. And the neighborhood where we moved, where we were one of the first African-American families that lived there, was started off as a almost purely white neighborhood, and within a few years it became a ghetto. And it was really amazing to me that a place could really rapidly turn to that kind of negative and destroyed space over a very short period of time. So I grew up in a segregated neighborhood, but I went to a so-called integrated school. And one of the marvelous things about the school that I went to was my third grade teacher was Mrs. Akins. And I just want to mention her because in her class, we learned a great deal about the environment. We learned about William Penn and the way he laid out Philadelphia. And we learned about the early development of the city of brotherly love. And one day, Mrs. Akins took me to what is called the Better Philadelphia exhibition. And it was a place that some 400,000 school children in Philadelphia went. And it was an exhibition that included models and photographs, and it was actually a film of how the city would develop in 25 years. And this was such an amazing exhibition. I went there, I was really impressed by that. And I decided on the spot that I wanted to be an architect and an urban planner as a result of this meeting that I had and this visit I had to the exhibition. My brother also was influenced by Mrs. Akins. We were both in the same class, although he was a year older than me. I skipped a little bit in the second grade, and I moved into the same class. But he actually had decided to become an astronomer because we had gone to the planetarium in Philadelphia. So it was years later when I began in the 1960s, when I had met all the students, or many of the students who became famous for their work in the civil rights movement and the sit-ins in the 1960s, that I learned that the Better Philadelphia exhibition was actually a public relations gimmick to move into the neighborhoods where African Americans had lived and displace them, to go live in wherever they went. But this became extremely valuable property in Philadelphia, in some neighborhoods that became kind of a wonderful location for elite people to live. And I also, Mrs. Akins taught us about the history of Philadelphia, but she never mentioned that when William Penn arrived in Philadelphia in the 1680s, he actually found African Americans living there who were brought by the Scandinavians. And William Penn himself had slaves. And this was a kind of an amazing shock to me that we had never learned anything when I was in elementary school about how the black people got to Philadelphia. But this was in broad daylight when he arrived. And he had gotten the grant from King Charles to what it was called Penn's Woods. Pennsylvania was Penn's Woods, because his father had made his wealth on slave trade in Jamaica. So no one ever told me about this until I was maybe 25 years old. I began to kind of research these things and began to discover that there was a great deal about the city that I didn't understand, and a great deal about my country that I didn't understand. And I was deeply influenced by the civil rights movement in the 1960s, And there was something that happened in the 1960s that was actually a predecessor for the environmental justice movement in particular. Although, as Michelle has pointed out, the environmental justice movement is really an extension of the civil rights movement, which is an extension in itself of a struggle against slavery, and it goes back many years. So I went to Columbia University School of Architecture, and the year before I went there was a famous exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art called Architecture Without Architects. And I went to that, and I was really impressed with that, and I wondered how people, especially poor people, and people without resources could actually produce such beautiful places. And I was really interested to try to learn more about the experience of not only African Americans but other people of color who managed to make these beautiful places. And as I finished my studies, and there was an uprising at Columbia University. Some of you may remember the generation that came just a little bit behind me, the African Americans, were very upset about the Columbia University building a gymnasium in Morningside Park. And that gymnasium was taking over land that the people in Harlem thought should be allocated to them. And this combination between these black students had turned the place out, and also white students who were anti-war advocates actually turned the place out and shut the university down for a month and caused the president to be fired. And I was president at Columbia University during that time, although I was not in the front lines of that event. And eventually I graduated from that school, and with a great deal of mixed feelings about what my education had taught me, because there was a great deal of difference between what we had learned how to do in architecture and planning at the university and the conditions in which people lived in Harlem. One of the things that was really important in that period was the development of something called advocacy planning, which many of you may not know much about, but it was a bringing together of ideas about urban planning and architecture that was in the service of poor people. And in many ways, it was a predecessor of the environmental justice movement. I mention that because some people feel that that this profound experience of the environmental justice movement started in the 1980s, which it did, but it actually had many precedents going back over the experience of African Americans in the United States from the very beginning. When I went to teach at Berkeley, UC Berkeley, in the architecture school, and made a huge effort to bring in students and faculty of people of color, and also taught courses that were especially tailored to the conditions of African Americans. And we're looking for precedents for our struggle to make the movement successful. And at the end of a period of several years working at Berkeley, I decided that I would not go up for tenure because I didn't find a very receptive environment for the kind of studies that I was very interested in. And one of the most ambitious efforts on my part, I wrote a two-part essay on the big house and the slave quarter, showing how the early development of the United States was actually the slave plantation, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So I left the university and was fairly successful in establishing my own firm and proceeding with development. And I got a contract to design, along with several other firms, to design the Berkeley Waterfront. And this was at a time when we had an African-American mayor, an African-American city manager, and several department heads who were African American as well as several people um, on the city council. But by the time that I got there and started to work on this, we were having public meetings, and there were almost no African Americans showing up in public meetings to help support the planning for the Berkeley Waterfront. And an African American got up in front of the audience in the public hearing and said that we did not need a Berkeley waterfront that was mainly for recreation. You can't eat open space, and someone in the audience booed him. And I heard when some person make a remark under his breath, "Go back to South Berkeley." South Berkeley happened to be the place where I lived, and I was kind of shocked at this because I thought Berkeley was supposed to be kind of the apex of mobilization of progressive people, and this was kind of a shock to me to hear some of the nasty comments that were made by many people in the environmental movement. So this was what was really a challenge for me. That as my firm got to be more and more successful, I found it very difficult to maintain a staff that was African Americans, and certainly had a great deal of difficulty trying to do projects that would have a positive impact. In fact, there was no way you could actually measure the impact of these projects on the African American community, because most of the time the question of who actually got the benefit of these new developments was not really framed in such a way you could figure out how they could help solve so many problems that existed in our own communities, including the issues that have to do with the school to prison pipeline, the high unemployment rates, the terrible housing conditions, and so on. So, okay. So I left the. I made a decision that at that point that I would have to find another way, try to figure out another way to make a living, and I closed my office, and I worked with a colleague of mine who'd been a mentor, writing a book called Places for Peace, and I got the idea that there might be a different way, and so we founded the Urban Habitat Program, and the purpose of the Urban Habitat Program was to build multiracial and multicultural leadership for sustainable communities in the Bay Area. Now, some of you may remember that the whole issue of sustainability came up at the conference about UN Environment and Development in 1987, and again in Rio. We were kind of pioneers at that time, but we were also pioneers in the environmental justice movement. We came along about 4 or 5 years after the incident in Warren County, North Carolina. And when Reverend Ben Chavis published his book called Toxics and Race, and Reverend Chavis and his partner, a research director, Charles Lee, did a tour across the nation and stopped in many places and took testimony about the toxic waste dumps that were located in those poor communities. And it turned out that, as Michelle pointed out, that 4 out of 5 communities really faced this exposure to toxic waste. At that time, there were a large kind of explosion of interest in environmental justice, and it was really the first time that there was an open kind of rebellion against the sort of so-called mainstream environmental movement that had been continuing unabated with positive feeling from the press. But a letter from the from a group in New Orleans complaining about the racism within the environmental movement was written in 1990, and they basically pointed out that the, the environmental groups that had represented the environment had very rarely represented the interests of poor people and people of color, and there were very few, in fact, no representatives on the staff or the board of these organizations. And this complaint led to a powerful explosion of interest among people across the country. I remember one of the first publications was a publication by Dana Alston called "We Speak for Ourselves," and these groups got together in 1991 and had celebrated the conference, first People of Color Environmental Justice publication among people of color in Washington, D.C. in October 1991. So we had many, at that time, an explosion of interest. We published The Race, Poverty, Environment with Luke Cole, and it actually took off. It was, not only was it a publication documenting the dynamics of racism and the social justice issues. We went through a whole range of environmental issues, and we found that there was a social justice dimension to the other community. All the community issues that were raised by the environment had social dimension, social justice, whether it was energy policy or water policy or policy that had to do with food, the border issues. We went through all these issues, but it was also a way of developing the leadership of people of color. What we did is we selected an editor who was a person of color, and then they went and got many people who were interested in a particular issue, and then the issue became their platform and our platform. And so in that way, we were able to diversify the environmental movement, at the same time developing many people who could move out into the culture of the community as a whole, and many of whom got academic appointments as well as appointments of great interest across the country and represented social organizations. And right now, as we look back over that period of time, we could see how the beginning of that activity, which took a kind of a new dimension and new issues, has become a global issue in countries all over the world. So I think maybe I'll stop at that point.
That's a perfect opportunity. Thank you, Carl, very much for giving us the trajectory of the movement through your own personal narrative. Now I want to take us into a discussion amongst the three of us, as I said, about where the environmental justice movement has been, where we are now, and where we're going. I think you will very much enjoy this. I'm going to turn to Professor Mia White and just ask her the simple question of how did you come to this work, Mia? Please.
Hey, y'all. Hello. So I just do want to say very quickly that Carl and I became friends when I was a junior program officer at the Ford Foundation, right after I had gotten my master's degree. And he and I were often the very late workers in the office, and somehow I got lucky and my office had been right next to his. And I remember one time, because everyone's gone, and sometimes I didn't know that he was there, so I would blast my music from my. This is back when we had Napster, on my PC. And one night, it was like 9:30 p.m. One night, here comes a knock on the door, and I'm like, oh no, somebody's hearing my loud music, and it's Carl. And he said, what is this young people music that you're listening to? What is this? And so it was Angie Stone. So I turned him on to Angie Stone, which, he barely remembers now. But anyway, that's my story about Carl back in the day. Danced a little bit to Angie Stone in the hallway at the Ford Foundation. So how did I get to this work? I'm Black and Korean. I'm from Queens. And I'll just very quickly tell you that my first experience with race and space, and this is how I understand environmental justice, is through race and space, was being a street vendor with my mom down by Tompkins Square Park. And we sold panties, 3 for $5, pantyhose, 6 for $5, tube socks, 6 for $5. Anyway, you know, it was always for $5, something for $5. And, you know, I wore the cash apron, and my mother would chain smoke in her lawn chair. And sometimes we would need to grease the wheels with the police, you know, who came by looking for a handout, $20 here or there, or they would want free tube socks, which you would give them, or whatever it was that they needed. Sometimes, though, they would kind of chase us out, but it wasn't like in the Giuliani days. They would chase us out, but you know, we knew we could come back. So we just need to move temporarily because there was either a new cop or, you know, so, you know, just to give the illusion that there was order. And I always connected this feeling of fraughtness and risk, you know, with our plastic 2 tables and our 3 for $5 right by the park, Tompkins Square Park. So that's the first, you know, very, very vivid memory for me of thinking about race and space and how it's so embodied in my childhood experience. And then the second one is, fast forward, I decided that I needed to get far, far away from Mia White in New York City, the identity of Mia White in New York City. Okay, so I'm, you know, born and bred here. So I decided that I was going to go to college and study monkeys. And I was going to do that, and I was going to go to the rainforest. So basically I was going to become a scientist. I was going to cleanse myself. This is all my, you know, sunken place thinking back then. So I was going to somehow cleanse myself scientifically of all of the difficulty of my childhood. I was going to be I was going to be the Afro-Asian Deanne Fossey. I went to Madagascar. I was studying lemurs. I was in a tent for 5 months. And one day I got an email from my professor, and she told me, Mia, you look Malagasy, and I need you to do me a favor. I need you to do a survey of the villages around the national park. We just want to ask them a few questions about their experience with the new national park plan. So, you know, I'm there to be a scientist, right? I'm there to cleanse myself of politics, right? Of course, you know, this was, again, my reawakening that, of course, that's impossible. So here I am with my interpreter, Josephine, and I have my clipboard, and I'm interviewing different people, and I realize that when my advisor discovered a thought to be extinct species of lemur, basically they just went in there with the government and USAID and drew a circle in this rainforest and told the villagers, guess what? Now we have a new national rainforest, and y'all can't come in here and procure bamboo. If you want to, it only during this period of time because the researchers are going to be studying, et cetera, and so forth. And I realized that I was one of those researchers, 19-year-old that I was one of those researchers that even though I looked like them, you know, I definitely was, I was a colonizer. I was there to extract knowledge and to ignore the politics of the place that I was exacerbating. So those two, I could go on, but those two really were the beginnings of my real politicization. And what leads me now to continue to push my own epistemological awakening is that in the classroom, whether it was in the Black Studies department, which I came from at UC Santa Barbara, or now with environmental studies students continue to say, okay, I get justice as a goal and sustainability as a goal, but how are we supposed to get there, and what are we supposed to do about the government, about murder, about capitalism, about all of the horror that we see, the earthquakes, war? How do we survive on a day-to-day basis? And so these questions continue to push my own research, which I'll talk about, I guess, in a few minutes.
No time like the present.
Okay. Okay. So the way that I understand the work of Carl and Michelle and others, and these are also mentors of mine. You know, I met them when I was 25 or so. Is spatial practice through which we should theorize. And when I say theorize, I just mean the word, I mean, I'm not trying to be fancy. I understand the word theorize to simply mean make meaning, right? How do you make meaning out of the work of Black and brown spatial practice, right? So environmental justice advocacy and community-based work, how do you make meaning out of it? In other words, how do you theorize it? And how do I theorize it? I theorize Black and brown spatial practice as love. And you know, Michelle was rolling her eyes at me a little bit a few weeks ago, and she does love love. So I'm gonna work with you on this idea of love. So when I'm talking about love, I'm not talking about romantic love. I'm talking about love in the spatial embodied sense of radical vulnerability, trench rituals of belonging and dreaming. So I invoke dreaming because when I see community-based activists working against all odds, right? In the Huey Newton sense of revolutionary suicide, right? In the sense of here is the world, the world today, right this moment laid out, and we are still persisting. We are still resisting, right? I see that as this radical Afrofuturism in practice. It's like making the future right now, right? Insisting on the future despite what we see, right? Black Panther's coming out for any of you guys who are into Black sci-fi, right? So I'm very committed to science fiction and Afrofuturism and these ideas of radicalism as us making the future now. And that's what I see community-based work as, is this futurism, this resistant futurism. And I try to theorize that as love. And why? Why love? Not because it's catchy. In fact, actually, as embodied as a cis woman of color, actually, it's very fraught for me to bring up love, right? Because of all the patriarchy that we engage in. But I insist on it because we have such a weak understanding of love. We have an epistemological individuation idea about love. We think about love as one-on-one. We have very, very little vernacular understanding about how to make love in space. We don't actually know what we're doing. And when we see it happening, we only characterize it as resistance. But I think that if we moved a little bit further and thought about it as a theory of love, then we can actually help each other survive day to day as we experience earthquakes and war and oppression and capitalism. And so with my students, I talk about 3 spaces, and then I'll pause. The first space I think about as our embodied space. So like, your body, obviously, but not just your body, but where your feels, as Fred Moten, who I love, talks about your feels, the structure of your feeling. Where do you feel what you feel, right? How do you feel what you feel? That structure of feeling, that's the first space. I know it sounds a little bit esoteric, but okay. And then the second space is institutions, how we project that out. So institutions meaning rules and organizations, like an institution of like marriage, and an institution like the phrase I do. That when you say I do, you make something happen, right? So it's a kind of institution, it's a rule, and marriage also as an institution. And then the third space is politics, what is carnally created when you mix the first and 2 spaces. So the way that I think about the problem of the traditional environmental movement is that it does not theorize or envision the relationship or even the existence of these 3 spaces, right? And how I've come to these 3 spaces is really struggling to understand the work on the ground through a lens of love. When you look at it as material struggle, trench rituals of belonging and dreaming, the construction of collective freedoms through mutual trauma healing in our haunted places, right? When you think about love in those terms, then these spaces, these first, second, and third spaces seem really critical to our understanding of environmental justice, right? So, sorry, went off on a tangent, that's all.
No, thank you for bringing us there. So I want to turn to Carl and ask him how you theorize the practice or environmental justice connecting to that. I mean, you've been working to help us conceive a more global awareness of environmental justice and thinking about even taking us to the concept of space. So could you jump in here and tell us a little bit about your theories?
Well, you know, Mia's theory is new to me, but the reality that she's describing isn't really new to me. And I'm thinking about one of the last projects that we worked on. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm thinking about one of the last projects that we worked through at Breakthrough Communities, and it was called the Six Winds Coalition. And this coalition came together in California when the state government said we have to cut the greenhouse gas emissions in the state. And they then said that every metropolitan planning commission in the state, of which there are 18 that spend, each of which spend about $200 billion a year, would have to cut down the use of single occupancy vehicles to get around. And there was a projection of how they could do that. And they said, well, all of the community development in California is really dependent on our transportation infrastructure. We have to change it. And we have to change it so that instead of building suburbs, instead of building suburban sprawl, that we now need to have our communities organized around the transit systems that make communication possible. And, you know, this was a wonderful opportunity, but it was a two-edged sword because many of the communities were actually quite worried that as these ideas were given expression, that it would mean that the poor people and the Black people and the Latino people who lived near those old neighborhoods with public transit would now be displaced and moved out to the farther reaches of the suburbs. And in fact, that's what happened. So these groups came together, and there were groups that were concerned about investment without displacement. There were groups that were concerned about transportation justice, people who were concerned about health equity and active living, affordable housing, particularly in privileged neighborhoods, and affordable housing for working people. And this group of 26 organizations came together and decided in response to this proposal to develop a new plan to reflect the interests of communities. This group decided that it would produce a plan for the 7 million people in the Bay Area, particularly the poor people and the people who are struggling with social and racial justice. The way the group came together is at that first meeting, people spoke up. There were about 250 people at that first meeting, and about 25 or 26 of those groups spoke out and said they were concerned about social and racial justice. And I thought this was a really great opportunity to test our theory about community development. And so we developed something called the Six Winds Coalition, actually in resistance and opposition to the dominant plan that was being developed by the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, but it was not a resistance against the main point of reducing our CO2 emissions. But anyway, we developed this plan for the 7 million people in the Bay Area based upon principles of social and racial justice. And when it came to the time of the EIR, the Metropolitan Transportation Commission had already established 5 basic plans that it would test for the EIR, the Environmental Impact Report. And one of our allies, who was a supervisor and county supervisor, made the motion. He said, I make the motion that we actually drop one of the plans that we have established. And I make the motion that we include the one that was developed by the community that was not part of the official planning process. And then something really remarkable happened. A Republican supervisor got up and said, I make the motion that we make this inclusion unanimous. And so this was like a shock to everybody. It was like, going out to the World Cup. We'd been waiting in the audience. About 200 of our allies had been there ready to make speeches and so forth. And our opportunities didn't come until 11 o'clock at night. This was really an unexpected opportunity. And so we did this plan, and the plan was tested. It turned out to be the preferred alternative. And what was really remarkable was not only did it outperform the official plans, but it actually, for CO2 emissions, but also on other criteria like investment without displacement, like health equity, and so forth. So this plan was acknowledged by the environmental impact report as being superior to the plans that were developed. And although we didn't get everything put in the final plan that we had articulated, many of the suggestions were included. But I think the process of bringing that 25 people together that expanded over the next 3 years to community groups all over the Bay Area it was definitely a process of implementation of what do you call it? Love? What was it?
Yes.
Love.
I don't have the language down yet.
Love.
But before the evening is over, I'm going to have my language down.
Well, so, all right, so I'm going to expand the love to, in terms of infrastructure development, because when we think about environmental justice, when we think about planning, building, land use, those of us that are here in cities, I mean, it always comes down to a question of who gets the benefits and who gets the harms. Mm-hmm. So as we're expanding the definition of love, how am I doing? And we want to take it to housing. Mm-hmm. Take us there in terms of thinking about environmental justice, this concept and theory about relating or being about love and housing.
Okay, so referring back to the first, second, third space conceptuals that I laid out, I think about housing, and again, I endeavor to scare myself and hopefully to make you uncomfortable and to be as radical as possible with how we think about these first, second, and third spaces. And one way to think about housing would be, well, the way that so much so-called environmental harm occurs, obviously very racialized. Hopefully you understand that goes without saying for us up here. So much of that occurs predicated on this system, right, of equity in the housing, in the literal structure of the home, right, and tax benefits, right, and sort of this sort of capitalist cycle that occurs that creates a relationship between land and structure, right? And so in my dissertation work, I looked at a model that tried to stop the pulling apart of the relationship between the land and the housing. And it's an imperfect model called the Community Land Trust. It's an imperfect model that needs to be critiqued and explored and experimented with. But when we pull apart, when we see them as individuated again, right? And I use this phrase, epistemological individuation, right? Where it's just Michelle in the world, or it's just Mia in the world, or it's just her house and it's just her land. When we do this individuation, which of course capitalism is predicated on, we are going to create, right, these vortexes of harms. And given that the space of North America is so racialized historically and genealogically, it's impossible that the harm will not be racialized. So what the relationship with housing, I would say, is in the most radical sense, in the truest form of love. If we're going to be seeing love in the first, second, and third space, it would require that we stop housing We stop envisioning housing or dreaming housing as answers to individual nuclear family units. And again, I recognize that, you know, maybe not everybody agrees with that. Many of us, including myself, own a home or co-own a home, and we receive benefits, vast benefits, from extracting from the, you know, variety of mortgage interest tax credits, for instance, that the government makes available to us. But those benefits are part of the problem. Right, so I'm saying that I too, while I endeavor and dream of a future, even as I sit here with you and try to struggle through this, I too am part of the problem. So, you know, love is this spatial theory of love. It's about abolition. It's about abolition and knowing that it can't happen immediately, instantaneously, but discourse matters, because what you speak is what we end up seeing. You know, so like if I say in this room was just people, you would just envision the people and not the red chairs. So words matter and discourse matters and dreams matter, even though I'm making money off of a capitalist home ownership program right now, I can still say to you, this is actually the wrong way for us to go about seeking environmental justice. Does that make sense?
It makes a great deal of sense. You know, I think as I reflect on what you're saying, I remember reading a book called The Private City. And basically, it really talks about how the process of urban development from the beginning of this country up until the present time has been dominantly a wealth-building exercise. It would, you know, and the challenge of communities coming together to solve their problems or to project solutions that would actually benefit the community was actually marginalized, and there are not very many examples across the country of this having been successful. So I think your point about resistance, on the one hand, is what we're saying no to, but I think also this positive sort of lifting up the beloved community as kind of the heart of what we're really building for, it makes us realize that actually, when you think about it really seriously, you have to ask, what is the purpose of making cities? What is the purpose of designing all these buildings? And the sad truth is, for the most part, there is no purpose except making money. There's no grounding for why we should be doing this except somebody's making a pile of money. And I think the idea of positing an alternative to that view, that the main thing that we're struggling for is to be able to create the beloved community, is a profound expression of what I think is a purpose that is consistent with our long-term view of what humanity is about and what our various communities are struggling for.
Carl, Carl, you are a group, you're part of a group, talk about beloved community of wise elders in Berkeley, a group of elders. And part of what the environmental justice movement is about is a multiracial, multi-generational movement to embrace justice. And I would, we're sitting in a room for the most part of students that are here to be able to learn in practice and theory. And so I would like to ask you to channel the group of elders and yourself as you were thinking through questions about the future, about mortality, about helping us, leave us with something to be able to move forward in the work that we're doing around environmental justice and questions of race. So just want to ask you to go there for us.
Well, I've been thinking about this for a while, and I came across a book by a man named Thomas Berry, and he wrote a book called Dream of the Earth. And he then collaborated with a an astrophysicist whose name is Brian Swim, and they wrote something called the universe story. And in this universe story, they said the reason that we are, mainly looking at the issues of ecological destruction across the world. And he was saying that in order to really address these issues properly, we need a new creation story that's based on what science is teaching us. And so they wrote this creation story, which explains why we should be in awe and why we should have wonder and why we should be in appreciation of all of the thousands and thousands of species and the mountains and the rivers and all these things, which should be really the kind of positive sense of what our present is about. We need to adopt something he called the universe story. And I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about some of the struggles that we have since the 1960s. You know, we had the ideas of Martin Luther King, the beloved community, and then we had Black Power, which in its own way was kind of an affirmation of love. And then our community started to go through another transition, and we had the proliferation of more fragmentation in the African American communities than we had ever seen before. And our struggle was to begin to develop new theory, a new approach to how and why we are projecting ourselves forward into the future. And then we were faced with the proliferation of many of these social movements that were kind of in identity politics. And also because the national, miraculously, right after the civil rights legislation was passed in 1965, the country decided to open up its borders to the world. And so we had mass immigrations coming, people coming here from every part of the world. And so what occurred to me is that we need a new story. We need a story that embodies our highest aspirations for future. And this story needs to incorporate a much deeper sense of purpose. And it seems to me that this idea that you're suggesting is that this purpose really is to really express our love for each other and our love for the environment that we live in, and how we build should be really consistent with that. So this is my work, and you'll find it in the current book, that the Earth, the City, and the Hidden Narrative of Race begins to project a new story and gives some examples that we've been really trying to develop about how we might really pursue this. And I think these are very consistent with your vision of purpose of our work is actually to begin to embody this appreciation of the beloved community.
Mia, what are some of your suggestions that we could be working together as a community here in the New School to move us towards this goal, or as individuals who are going back to their community to be able to work towards these goals?
I think what Carl said, this idea that we are storytellers and that we need to be thinking and dreaming very fiercely and very bravely, and not be afraid of ridicule, which is such a very basic human fear, that will be laughed at or that will be seen as kind of silly or dumb or lightweight. I think we need to dream very forcefully and very fearlessly. And part of why it's so important is when we dream in our first space, as I talked about, we acknowledge our own traumas, our own unacknowledged traumas, right? And that then allows us to acknowledge the traumas that we see in the other spaces. It's very difficult for people to acknowledge trauma in spaces outside of themselves without also attempting to do healing of trauma in their embodied space. And I, of course, that should hearken to so much indigenous work. For those of you who are familiar with indigenous environmental justice, it makes perfect sense. And this idea is not to focus on trauma, but to use trauma toward healing and dreaming. And I want to read this poem because it tells a different story of a very familiar character that all of you will know from the news. And this is a poem by Ross Gay, and it's called A Small Needful Fact. A small needful fact is that Eric Gardner worked for some time for the Parks and Rec Horticultural Department, which means perhaps that with his very large hands, which we have heard so much about, perhaps in all likelihood, he put gently into the earth some plants, which most likely, some of them, in all likelihood, continue to grow this very moment, continue to do what such plants do, like house and feed small and necessary creatures, like being pleasant to touch and smell, like converting sunlight into food, like making it easier for us to breathe. So Eric Gardner obviously is a victim of racialized police brutality, but we don't also recognize the everyday revolutionary acts that Eric Gardner performed. So one way for us to love more authentically and fearlessly is to tell stories about each other is to see each other as daily, ordinary heroes, so that we think of the revolution as happening on a daily basis, not as happening into some far away horizon. We can think of Eric Gardner as a hero, not simply because he is a symbol of something that made people stand up and fight, but also because he put his hands into the earth.
Thank you. Thank you, Carl. Thank you, Mia. I want to open it up now to the audience for us to have a broader discussion. But, the poem really makes me think about, as I work with and in many spheres with environmental institutions, environmental organizations, research outfits, organizations I'm on the board of, and how we are thinking about what environmentalism and conservation really is about. What it needs to be about is making sure that we connect to the social, economic, and political realities. It needs to connect to humans, to humanity. I worked for the EPA for several years, and a lot of people just, think that the Environmental Protection Agency is about protecting the environment, but it's human health and the environment. We always drop off those initial words. So our humanity is inextricably linked to environment, and that is what environmental justice is about. So let's share one of the microphones. I'm going to ask if you have a question to please raise your hand.
This made perfect sense, that agape love, collective love, if we could foster a greater mentality around that could generate perhaps some benefits to us all. I guess the question I have is, how do we get there? And I guess I want to ask that question in the context of what's currently going on, which is this tax bill, which seems like in part a backdoor attempt to rein in some of the progressive things that might be taking place in certain states. So if California is a leader in this, Jerry Brown's trying to, and maybe he's not the leader, but at least they're making efforts to foster movements ahead with regards to addressing climate change. But the tax bill is doing things that are mean, like states would, if you're an individual from a state that taxes you, you'll be limited in your ability to deduct that, therefore starving the beast in these localities to implement global changes that can have an impact. So given this competition threat that takes place across these various entities, what can we do to foster agape or collective love or authentic love?
Well, again, I want to point out, I made a move when I closed my office and decided that that my role as an African American urban planner and architect would be to try to become a person who was in that lineage, a person who was in the lineage of learning from my ancestors and trying to make it possible for people who came after me to be able to live and work in the context of being able to create a future for us all. And so the idea of standing up and fighting for a kind of practice that actually put the advocacy planning that we had developed, that we had thought about in the 1960s, but by putting it on its head and saying that we would not only lead this advocacy planning in these neighborhoods, but that we would actually create a region-wide organization, which the Urban Habitat Program was originally, to promote regional equity. And I think as we worked across the nation and as we began to build a kind of discourse around the idea of regional equity, I think Breakthrough Communities has really been kind of experimenting with this idea of coming together around a new vision of what our metropolitan regions could be and would have to be. So we developed a toolkit and some practices that we've learned over the years for the next generation. And I believe that the next generation of architects and planners and urban strategists should really focus on how we can make these communities more cohesive, how we can really address problems that have been thought of as being sort of outside of the realm. For example, what we do about the prison population, which is in its own way a form of hatred, that we actually confront that. And I love our partner who's been sort of advocating this idea of a love army. Tony, what's his name? Tony, yeah. I think that we're beginning to see that actually there really is something deep that makes a man want to go out and talk to coal miners who voted for Trump to find out what it is that not only what motivated them, but also to really wanting to listen to their pains and their concerns and try to draw that circle, which we had drawn around our own communities and neighborhoods, to draw a larger circle to include humanity that we might have thought as being outside of it. So I think there's something to this that really we should think about.
Hi, I want to thank you for the language of the embodied space of love. I live in Central Harlem right now, and there is a push to rezone this residential community to commercial zoning. And so I work with the Tenants Association, so we're fighting the commercial zoning. And we didn't quite have the language to speak to politicians about what we're fighting for. Because just to say quality of life isn't the depth of what we're talking about, and it is. And so thank you for this language of embodied space, because that's what it is. My next door neighbor has lived in there. She was raised in her apartment. Her mother raised her there, and now she's raising, her and her husband just got married, and so, but it's all of this community, it's just this embodied space of love that makes life so rich here. And so when we look at trying to express this to politicians, because we have to have this, we're trying to have this language to speak speak with them about why they shouldn't rezone this community to a commercial zoning, right? That we basically on Lenox Avenue, because I live in Lenox Terrace, that we basically turn into 34th Street or 125th Street. Is like the value of having community, to have the space of this embodied space of love. So again, thank you for that language. And so now how do we go forward, like with politicians? Because, you know, when you start talking embodied space of love, they go, ew, 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 ew. Right. So, you know, how do we like have this really serious conversation about this? Right.
I just want to get into one more conversation.
So I wanted to ask Mia if you thought things like worker co-ops, eco villages, and intentional communities were also part of the vortex of harm, or could be outside of it.
So briefly, and so that Carl can jump in. Thank you for your comment. I think I would say, and you probably already know this, to be prepared to be laughed at, and I think it's really important to anticipate it, and then to be okay with that. And the reason I say this is because we're trying with this idea of talking about something as everywhere and nowhere as love, is we are trying to change the terms of connection and the literal terms of how we communicate. So it is not just about how productive you are or how productive a space is. And the only way, and sometimes the only way to force that is to do the ridiculous. And that sometimes means that we're going to be laughed at. The terms of connection, to me, seems like a very powerful way to think about how we are connected and belong in space versus what has this powerful body done to include people. So thinking not terms of inclusion, but terms of connection, because then that allows us to see a lot of the BS, frankly, and allows us to move away from tokenization, et cetera and so forth. I really don't have all the answers. I'm just talking off the top of my head. And then in terms of eco villages and so forth and so on, you know, the bougie side of Mia, love it, okay? But the Queensbridge side, where I spent some time in the project, you know, basically they become, you know, another set of carceral spaces, right? And this is the carceral world we live in. So the question is, you know, yes, it appeals to the bougie side of me, but the reality is if we don't all have access to that, then it is violent. It is symbolically violent for people to walk by and see or imagine what they see as this some sort of utopic thing that's antithetical to their, you know, lived experience, because it makes you literally feel like trash, like you just are irrelevant. And that's this terms of connection. If we have an eco village over there and we have real suffering in such close proximity, then the message is that well, I just don't care about you. I just simply don't have the time or the bandwidth or the energy to care about you. I have 2 children, and for kind of going back to Derek's question, I keep going back to parenting. My kids are 10 and 11. And the taxes have come up, you know, because their father talks about it anyway. So this question of like, mommy, you know, the president's mean, or mommy, why is this happening, or this and that, and I keep trying to explain to them, how do you think people should belong in the world? I don't want to use the same language that the tax code require. I know what I'm supposed to say. I'm supposed to train them to be really successful. There are some people that I'm not going to fight at the level of the tax code, because that's not where my power is. My power is as a parent and as an educator in the classroom. And what that means is that I want people to see themselves as powerful in whatever space they are. So for a 10-year-old to be able to push the conversation at the level of their teacher and to say, well, what you're saying means that the way people belong is this. And it torques the conversation a little bit. Right now, that's all I have, is how do we change the terms of the conversation?
Yeah, I want to point out the actual practical side of this. You know, in fact, I was in a quandary about what we're going to do about our housing situation. And you know, in the Bay Area, and I know in many places around the country in New York, we have a kind of new process of challenges that are coming around displacement, gentrification and displacement. There's people who are making all this money can come along and say, okay, you've been living here for 20 years. You got to get up and move because somebody who's richer and has more money needs to move in. And you know, when I thought about this, this is not that different than Rosa Parks having to get up, you know, on the bus and give her seat to a white man when, you know, the sort of common courtesy would express another approach. So what we're doing about these squatter settlements that are cropping up everywhere, the solution to this, you know, might be in figuring out some kind of gimmick to put together a new property arrangement so that some developers could make some more money. But actually, this is, in my view, is not actually a practical alternative. When we look at the dangers and the horror that stands before us, when we look at the flooded city of Houston, or we look at what's happened in Puerto Rico, or we look at the fires that have come to Northern California, and what we're going to do about this, which is really more practical, thinking about how we can think of what Naomi Klein called disaster capitalism, right? Where we can rebuild these things so richer people can move in. Or are we actually trying to create communities that have the capacity to be resilient and also to be sustainable? And so it's, in some ways, you may think it's ridiculous, you may think it should be cause for ridicule. But I think on the other side of it is also a practical understanding that we need to be able to use all of this creative power to make our communities whole again. And I think that it may turn out that thinking about it that way and acting on that is a really viable solution. And as I have been kind of conceptualizing it, you know, I've been thinking about the movements for a right to the city as being a fundamental embodiment of this principle of love. So it makes a lot of sense to me that you've actually articulated this.
Thank you. I'm very, very happy to be here tonight. The spirit in the room is...
Could you speak a little bit?
The spirit in the room is very embracing. There's a lot of concern. And we're the ones who put feet to the pavement and got here tonight to join together and do some solution buildings. Very, very happy about Carl and Mia and the rest that I don't know their names, doing their due diligence, caring. They're fundamental virtues that lay a foundation for growth and connection in our lives. And technology language is largely replacing the sensitivity and the caring so that people think that the checkbook is the heart or the credit card is the heart, and our children are seeing this. And it's giving a message to them that as they grow, it's going to be hard for them to divest themselves of that insensitivity. So I'm questioning it. I'm a teacher to early childhood. We can't start too young to restabilize and collect and protect the essence of humanity, and like Mia is saying, we can't be ashamed to put that out front in our homes, in our neighborhoods, in our schools, etc. So educationally, what are we looking at? We're advanced in this building, in this room. We talk about higher education. But I think where the rubber meets the road is, what are we doing in early education?
Mine is just a nitty-gritty kind of question, and it's because I lived in San Francisco about 50 years ago, 40 years ago, and I wondered what has happened since you come from there. What has happened in Hunters Point? Because it was one of the most oppressed neighborhoods 40, 50 years ago, but it had a wonderful climate. So I always thought that eventually it was going to be stolen and gentrified, and I wonder if that has happened yet. I know probably the Fillmore has, and the Western Addition has, and certainly anyway, it's a very nitty-gritty question. I wonder what has happened to Hunters Point after all these years.
Carl, let's start out with that question. Let's start out with the answer to the Hunts Point question, then let's go into education and what we should be doing with the young people. I'll turn to you, Carl, to update us on what's happening in Hunts Point.
Well, I think the struggle continues. And in Bayview, Hunters Point, there's been a rapid challenge of gentrification and displacement, and their huge response to the efforts of developers to cover up the toxic waste dumps and build housing on top of it without actually cleaning it up. So the struggle continues, and I think we can also look at the Western Addition, look at many other places that have that those struggles are becoming more intense. So I think there's a lot of work to do. I don't know how much of it is going to be really easy. I think we're just going to have to struggle through and hopefully be able to prevail, at least in many cases where our work has been going on.
I would add briefly, this is where public sector dollars really matter. One of our proteges that have been mentored by Carl Anthony is Juliet Ellis, that works for the Public Utility Commission in San Francisco. And it matters who sits at the table. Juliet is the vice president and has ensured that millions and millions of dollars is going to community development in Hunters Point, since the public utility has jurisdictional authority in parts and pieces of the development. So this is a endeavor, an opportunity that is unique and in terms of the Bay Area, And we need to think about how to scale up that model. She is thinking about how to scale up that model and bring that responsibility and accountability more to public commissions, utility commissions around the country. Mia, do you want to, since you have a 10 and 11-year-old, and I know think a lot about young people, do you want to give some thought to how we can really nurture young people in thinking this through?
Yeah, I'll say that I'm a kind of a weird parent in the sense that you want your water?
No.
Okay. That I love ghost stories. The Walking Dead. I love apocalyptic. I love all that, and my kids know that. I mean, I don't let them watch that, but we have this thing about telling each other ghost stories. I know, but I make it work. We make it work, and one of the things that it's a slippery slope, obviously, but we talk about things being haunted a lot. This could be. Anyway, I won't go to where it comes from. But we talk about haunted places a lot. And, sometimes if we're walking by somewhere, we'll say that place feels haunted, or that place seems haunted. Something about it seems like there's more there than other people would notice. And what I'm trying to cultivate in my children, right, is a sense of their power to speak what they feel, even if it doesn't make sense to the so-called rational mind. And I think this is so important, especially for my son, but also for my daughter, to be able to do this. Despite having a PhD from MIT, I persist in this feeling that we know so much. We have a structure of feeling that's so complicated and so deep in the universe, but we shut down our ability to communicate because we seek acceptance and belonging within a very narrow capitalist framework. And it's a kind of hate making, frankly. And like in the way that gentrification is kind of a haunting of Rosa Parks, for instance. Making money is because it's so predicated on individual attainment, is a kind of hate making. So it's the antithetical idea to this world making, love as abolition, dreaming the future. But I just want to tell one very brief story, which is after Katrina hit, I went down to Mississippi and I was doing some work down there. And I met this woman. Her name is Rose Johnson, a Black woman, and she had started a Black community land trust. And that was the first time that I had ever heard of the concept community land trust. Okay, so I was learning from Rose about why a Black community land, or why a community land trust at all. And the location of this land trust is in Turkey Creek in North Gulfport. This area is down in the marsh that was redeveloped. This was the safe space from white people on the other side of the railroad tracks. This is where freed Black people settled after emancipation. Okay, so there's anyway, to make a long story short, when I would write up my report, because I worked at the Ms. Foundation for Women back then, when I would write up my report, I went back and forth like 20 times. People would say to me, "But Mia, why don't they just leave? Why don't they just leave?" And I would always tell the same thing that Rose, I watched her say this to a bunch of funders who came in on a bus. People very politely, with respect and kindness, asked her the same question. Why don't y'all leave? You can leave, why don't you leave? And she said, I was baptized in this creek. She said, that wetland is my body. This is my body. This is I am this place. The problem comes when we try to assess and evaluate the success of Rose's community land trust through a rubric of capitalist attainment. And in that rubric, she has failed because she has not developed a certain number of units, homes in the community land trust, because she has not made a certain amount of money in the community. But I'm talking to you right now about Miss Rose Johnson's story. And we don't yet have a rubric to communicate the value of our conversation right this moment. She's in Turkey Creek, and we are here talking about Rose Johnson's Black Community Land Trust that most people see as a failure, right? But we need to say to ourselves, this is a very smart Black woman. Why would she endeavor to create this thing and persist in it when she knows most people are calling her work a failure? But she's intelligent. So why would she persist in this failed enterprise? And that's the question we need to ask ourselves, because we're using the wrong logic frameworks for trying to understand her labor. And if we thought about it in a different way, right? However way you want to come up with, and I'm putting on the table this first, second, third, because she's saying that she was baptized in the creek and that the wetland is the same as her body, right? Then you would not ask, why don't they leave? You would never ask that question.
We're going to have to end, but I wanted to ask Carl. I wanted to, Carl, give you the last word, please, and remind folks that we'll be continuing this conversation Wednesday night from 6 to 8 as we launch, do the New York City launch of The Earth, the City, and the Hidden Narrative Race. Carl?
Well, you know, there's always something to learn. And I've learned something tonight. And I hope you all have learned something. That there is a different kind of rationale. I have always viewed environmental justice as an expression of our struggle. It goes back to the first people who were captured and enslaved and forced to live under very terrible circumstances. But I hadn't really conceptualized that struggle as having its manifestation be an expression of love. And I'm really having to ponder this, because I think it does represent a step forward in our thinking and gives us a sense of purpose, which I hope the next generation will be able to materialize. So thank you very much, Mia.
Thanks.
Thank you to Carl and Mia. Good night.